Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we are attempting, I guess you could say, a really deep dive into a political career that's just massive, one of the most extensive, and yeah, probably one of the most paradoxical in modern American history. We're talking about Joseph Robinette Biden Jr.
It's a huge canvas, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, you're looking at a public life that stretches over 5 decades. It starts way back in Delaware municipal government, then boom, 36 years in the U.S. Senate.
36 years. It's hard to even wrap your head around that length of service in one body.
And then, of course, 8 years as vice president under Obama,
Followed by the presidency itself. 4 years as the 46th president.
ending up as the oldest person ever to hold that office. He turned 80 while he was still president.
Which is just unprecedented. The sheer duration, the range of offices, it's almost unparalleled in American history. Serving continuously for half a century at that level.
Yeah, it really demands more than just listing dates and titles. We need to try and understand the person, the politician navigating all of that. So our mission today, for you listening, is really to cut through some of the noise, the day-to-day political commentary, and focus on the substance. What were the actual policy choices? What was his personal journey like?
We want to pull out those key legislative moments, the wins, the losses.
Understand the big turning points, both personal and political, that really shaped him. And maybe the most fascinating part, dig into this stark contrast we see.
You mean between the policy outcomes and how people felt about him?
Precisely. Historians are already starting to rank his presidency, pretty favorably in terms of legislative output. Yet public perception, especially towards the end, was persistently negative.
Driven largely by economic anxieties, as we'll see.
Right, and that perception gap ultimately, undermined his final years and led to that really unprecedented decision to withdraw from the 2024 race.
So we're looking for those connections, those aha moments that might help explain this incredibly long, incredibly complex story.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. The foundation.
The roots.
Joe Biden was born November 20th, 1942. Scranton, Pennsylvania. A Catholic family, mostly Irish descent. But that image, the middle-class Joe thing, that really comes from the family's early financial situation, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. That narrative is central to his political identity. His father, Joseph Sr., had some serious business setbacks early on. Things got tough enough that the family actually had to live with his mom's parents in Scranton for a while.
So it wasn't necessarily poverty, but it was definitely a step down, a period of instability.
Exactly. Financial strain, maybe a loss of status. They eventually moved to Delaware, Claymont first, then Wilmington when Joe Jr. was about 10. He often talked about seeing his father struggle to regain his footing.
And his father eventually found success as a used car salesman, right?
Yes, he did. But that earlier period, that feeling of precariousness, that seems to have left a really deep impression on Biden. It became the bedrock of his connection to working class and middle class voters.
Now, looking at his early life, there's this interesting sort of tension. He clearly had ambition, leadership qualities, but his academic record wasn't exactly stellar.
That's a recurring theme, isn't it? At Archmere Academy, a private Catholic school, he was class president his junior and senior years. So popular, a leader. But he himself admitted he was a poor student.
And that pattern kind of continued into university and law school.
It seems so. He went to the University of Delaware, then Syracuse University for law school, graduating in 1968. But he was ranked 76th out of a class of 85.
And there's a specific incident from law school that came back to haunt him later.
Yes, a very significant one for his later career. In his first year, he failed a course because he plagiarized 5 pages from a published law review article for a paper.
Wow, 5 pages.
Yeah. He claimed it was unintentional, a misunderstanding of citation rules. The faculty reviewed it, and while they initially failed him in the course, they later allowed him to retake it, and that specific failing grade was eventually struck from his record.
But the fact that it happened...
The fact that it happened became crucial biographical context. It resurfaced dramatically during his first presidential run decades later. It feeds into this narrative, perhaps, of ambition, sometimes outpacing, let's say, strict adherence to the rules.
Before the Senate, though, he did take his first steps into actual governing.
Right, on the Newcastle County Council in Delaware. Served from 1971 to 1973.
And wasn't his platform surprisingly progressive for that time and place?
It really was. Looking back, he was actively supporting public housing initiatives in the suburbs, which is a very hot-button issue then. He also opposed building large highway projects near Wilmington, arguing they would harm existing neighborhoods. It showed a kind of grassroots, almost activist streak early on.
Which then leads us to 1972, the big Senate race. He was a massive underdog.
A complete long shot. He was challenging J. Caleb Boggs, a popular two-term Republican incumbent, former governor, a giant in Delaware politics. Biden was only 29 when he decided to run.
And he had, what, practically no money?
Very little institutional support, minimal funds.
Right.
The campaign was famously a family affair. His sister, Valerie Biden Owens, was his campaign manager. Other family members pitched in constantly.
How did they even compete?
Delaware's small size was actually an advantage. They could run a very intense retail politics campaign. Lots of face-to-face interaction, distributing position papers by hand. It was energetic, relentless.
And his platform, what was he running on?
It was pretty forward-looking for 72. Environmental protection, strong support for civil rights, healthcare access, fair taxes, and critically, a clear call for withdrawal from the Vietnam War. He tapped into the anti-war sentiment and a desire for change.
Even so, the polls looked grim for a long time.
Yeah, he was trailing by almost 30 points just a few months out. But he kept pounding the pavement, and Boggs perhaps ran a slightly complacent campaign.
And the result was historic.
Absolutely stunning. Biden won by just over 3,000 votes, about 50.5%, making him at age 30 the seventh youngest person ever elected to the U.S. Senate, an incredible victory.
The absolute peak of political triumph for a young man.
And then, almost immediately, the most crushing personal tragedy imaginable.
It's just devastating to think about. Weeks after the election, December 18th, 1972, his wife, Nelia, and their one-year-old daughter, Naomi.
They were out Christmas shopping. Their station wagon was hit by a tractor trailer. Nelia and Naomi were killed instantly. His sons, Bo, who was 3, and Hunter, just 2, were in the car and were seriously injured, but survived.
The whiplash from that election high to this unimaginable low, it's hard to comprehend.
It almost broke him. He was actually sworn into the Senate in January 1973 at his son's hospital bedside in Wilmington.
He considered not taking the seat at all, didn't he?
He seriously thought about resigning immediately. He felt he couldn't possibly be a senator and a single father to 2 traumatized young boys. But Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield, a key figure here, talked him out of it.
How did Mansfield convince him?
Mansfield basically told him the Senate needed him, that they would accommodate his situation, allow him flexibility. He urged him to give it 6 months. It was a crucial intervention.
The emotional toll must have been immense. He's spoken about it since, about how dark that period was.
Very openly, especially later in life. He wrote about contemplating suicide, feeling immense anger, questioning his faith. He said he felt like God had played a horrible trick on him, that raw grief, that sense of duty to his surviving sons. It shaped everything that followed.
Including the famous commute.
Yes, the decision not to move his family to Washington, D.C. Instead, he started commuting daily by Amtrak train from Wilmington, over 90 minutes each way, every day for his entire Senate career.
That decision kept him rooted in Delaware, rooted in his family life, in a way most senators aren't.
It absolutely did. It became fundamental to his political identity, Amtrak Joe, the regular guy going home every night.
And eventually, he did find personal happiness again.
He did. He met Jill Tracy Jacobs, a teacher, in 1975 on a blind date set up by his brother. They married in 1977. He credits her enormously with helping him rebuild his life and renewing his passion for politics.
They had a daughter together, Ashley.
Ashley Biden, born in 1981, she became a social worker and activist, and of course his sons Bo and Hunter remained central to his life. Bo followed him into public service, becoming Delaware's Attorney General.
Tragically, Bo also died young from brain cancer in 2015, another profound loss.
A devastating blow, particularly as Bo was seen by many as the inheritor of his father's political mantle.
And Hunter. Well, Hunter's life and business dealings became much more complicated and eventually a major political issue during his father's presidency.
Yes, Hunter's career as a lobbyist, consultant, advisor, particularly his work in Ukraine and China, created significant political vulnerabilities later on. But that initial tragedy, the loss of Nelia and Naomi, and the focus on raising Bo and Hunter, that's really the crucible where the Joe Biden we know was forged.
Okay, so let's move into those long Senate years.
Yeah.
36 years, 6 re-elections. That kind of longevity gives you enormous influence.
Huge influence. He eventually chaired powerful committees, the Judiciary Committee, the Foreign Relations Committee. He was a major player.
When you look back at that legislative record, what stands out, especially on the domestic side?
Well, you have to talk about crime policy. That was a major focus for him, particularly in the 80s and 90s. He was deeply involved in two landmark crime bills.
The 1984 Act first.
Right, the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984. That was significant in itself, part of the Reagan-era focus on law and order. But the really big one, the one that's debated constantly now, is the 1994 Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act.
He was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee then, right? He really drove that bill.
He was the architect. It was a massive piece of legislation. It included things many Democrats supported, like the federal assault weapons ban, but it also contained provisions that significantly contributed to the era of mass incarceration. Things like 3 strikes, mandatory life sentences, huge funding increases for police and prisons. It really doubled down on punitive measures.
And that legacy became incredibly controversial over time.
Hugely controversial. Critics, especially on the left, point to the 1994 bill as a key driver of racial disparities in the justice system and the explosion of the U.S. prison population. It became a real political liability for him later.
Did he ever acknowledge those criticisms?
Yes, eventually he did, particularly during the 2020 campaign and his presidency. He expressed regret, saying that while the intentions behind parts of the bill, like community policing, were good, other parts went too far and had damaging unintended consequences. He specifically said some aspects were a mistake.
It shows maybe a capacity to evolve on an issue, albeit slowly.
Perhaps, or at least recognize the political necessity of addressing that legacy.
On a more positive note, in terms of social policy, what did he champion?
His signature achievement, the one he consistently called his proudest legislative accomplishment, was the Violence Against Women Act, or VABOA.
Also passed in 1994 as part of that crime bill, wasn't it?
It was initially included in the crime bill package. VABOA fundamentally changed the way domestic violence and sexual assault were treated under federal law. It provided funding for shelters, victim services, training for law enforcement, and created new legal avenues for victims. It was groundbreaking.
So a complex picture on domestic policy, champion of VABOA, but also architect of a crime bill with a difficult legacy.
Very much so. And it gets even more complex when you look at issues where he seemed to break with his party's base.
You're thinking of the bankruptcy bill.
Exactly. The 2005 Bankruptcy Abuse Prevention and Consumer Protection Act. This is a really crucial piece of his record for understanding his political positioning and, frankly, his vulnerabilities.
What did that bill do?
In simple terms, it made it much, much harder for individuals struggling with debt to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. That's the kind that wipes out most unsecured debts, like credit card debt or medical bills.
So it pushed people towards Chapter 13 instead.
Right, which requires them to enter into a repayment plan over several years. It was a huge win for the credit card industry and other lenders.
And Biden was a key supporter.
He was not just a supporter, he was a vocal advocate for it, and one of only 18 Democrats in the Senate to vote for it. It was fiercely opposed by almost all other leading Democrats, consumer protection groups, women's groups worried about divorced women. The opposition was intense.
Why did he back it so strongly? This seems counter to his middle-class Joe persona.
This is where his Delaware roots become absolutely critical. Delaware, as you know, is a major hub for the financial services industry, particularly credit card companies. MBNA, which was then one of the largest credit card issuers in the world, was headquartered there and was one of Delaware's biggest employers.
And Biden had ties to MBNA.
Strong ties. They were a major source of campaign contributions over the years. His son, Hunter Biden, also worked for MBNA for a period. Critics hammered him relentlessly, arguing he was putting the interests of his corporate constituents in Delaware ahead of struggling families nationwide.
That vote definitely stuck to him.
Oh, absolutely. It was used against him in the 2008 primaries, the 2020 primaries. It fed the narrative that despite the working-class image, he was perhaps too cozy with corporate interests.
Let's pivot to foreign policy during his Senate years. This became his real area of expertise, right? Especially as chair of Foreign Relations.
Yes, he increasingly focused on foreign policy and saw himself as a major voice on the world stage. His stance evolved over time, though.
How so? He voted against authorizing the first Gulf War in 1991.
He did. He argued at the time for giving sanctions more time to work. But his most defining moments in the 90s came in relation to the Balkans.
The wars in Bosnia and Kosovo?
Exactly. He became a very forceful advocate for intervention. He pushed hard for the lift and strike policy, lifting the arms embargo on Bosnian Muslims and using NATO air power against the Serbs. He even met face-to-face with Serbian leader Slobodan Milošević, apparently delivering a very blunt message.
And he supported the NATO bombing campaign in Kosovo in 1999.
very strongly. In fact, he later called his role in shaping U.S. policy towards the Balkans his proudest moment in public life related to foreign policy. He felt he had pushed the U.S. to act morally against genocide.
But then came the post-9/11 era, the war on terror. That seems like a more complicated chapter for him.
Much more complicated. He's an early and strong supporter of the war in Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks. His quote was basically, "Whatever it takes, we should do it." No hesitation there.
Iraq was different.
Iraq was very different and ultimately much more damaging to his reputation. As chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 2002, he played a really central role in the lead up to the war.
He held hearings.
He presided over the crucial hearings on Saddam Hussein's alleged weapons of mass destruction. Critics later pointed out that these hearings gave a prominent platform to pro-war voices and administration officials, while perhaps marginalizing dissenting experts who questioned the intelligence.
And crucially, he voted for the war authorization.
Yes. In October 2002, he voted in favor of the authorization for use of military force against Iraq. That vote would follow him for years.
Did he stand by it?
Not indefinitely. By 2005, as the insurgency raged and the WMD rationale collapsed, he publicly called his vote a mistake. He said he had voted based on intelligence presented to him, believing the goal was to allow weapons inspectors back in, not necessarily immediate invasion.
But calling it a mistake didn't stop him from supporting funding for the war, did it?
No, and that was the difficult line he had to walk. He continued to vote for appropriations to support the troops and the ongoing occupation, even while criticizing the war's strategy and execution. It made his position look inconsistent to some.
He did eventually propose alternative strategies, though.
Yes. By 2006-2007, he was actively opposing President Bush's troop surge strategy. And he controversially proposed a plan to effectively partition Iraq into 3 autonomous regions based on ethnicity, Shia, Sunni, and Kurd, linked by a weak federal government.
That idea didn't really go anywhere, did it?
It passed the Senate as a non-binding resolution, but it lacked support from the Bush administration and, more importantly, from Iraqi leaders themselves. It was seen as unworkable. So his foreign policy record, while extensive, shows both conviction, like in the Balkans, and significant missteps and course corrections, like on Iraq.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, as you say, connecting that long Senate career and foreign policy heft to his presidential ambitions. His first attempt was in 1988.
And it was, let's just say it ended quickly and badly, a real flameout.
What happened? He seemed like a strong candidate initially. Young, charismatic, chair of the Judiciary Committee.
He did. He entered the race in June 1987 with a lot of buzz. But the campaign almost immediately ran into trouble over messaging and, more significantly, biography. The killer blow came in September 1987.
The plagiarism issue resurfaced.
Big time. He was caught lifting passages, without attribution, from a speech by Neil Kinnock, who was then the leader of the British Labour Party.
Kinnock's speech was very personal, very powerful, about his family background.
Exactly, about being the first Kinnock in 1,000 generations to go to university. Biden used very similar phrasing and themes in his own closing remarks at debates and speeches, presenting Kinnock's life story almost as his own.
And it wasn't just Kinnock, right?
No. Once the Kinnock story broke, reporters dug deeper and found he had also borrowed lines from Robert F. Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey without crediting them. And then, crucially, the old law school plagiarism incident from Syracuse resurfaced in the news.
That's a perfect storm.
It got worse. The intense media scrutiny also uncovered a pattern of Biden making false or significantly exaggerated claims about his academic record and his past activism.
What kind of claims?
Things like saying he'd earned 3 undergraduate degrees, he earned 1, that he attended law school on a full scholarship, he received a partial needs-based grant, that he graduated in the top half of his law class, he graduated near the bottom, and that he had marched in the civil rights movement. There's no evidence he actively marched, though he was involved in other ways, like working at a public pool in a black neighborhood.
So the combination of plagiarism and these biographical embellishments.
It just destroyed his credibility at that moment. The narrative became about authenticity or the lack thereof. He withdrew from the race on September 23, 1987, just 3 months after entering. It was a humiliating setback.
A tough lesson learned about the national spotlight.
A very tough lesson about how your entire past becomes fair game.
Fast forward 2 decades, he tries again in 2008.
He does. This time, he's running explicitly on his experience, particularly foreign policy, positioning himself as the seasoned statesman compared to younger rivals like Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton.
How did that run go?
Not much better, frankly, in terms of results. He just couldn't gain traction against the excitement surrounding Obama or the established network of Clinton. He finished a distant fifth in the Iowa caucuses with less than 1% of the delegates and dropped out shortly after.
Another failed presidential bid. But this one had a silver lining.
A massive silver lining. Because that very experience and perceived gravitas that failed to win him votes were exactly what Barack Obama was looking for in a running mate.
It seems counterintuitive, though. They weren't particularly close, were they? There was even some reported friction.
Reports suggest Biden might have resented Obama's incredibly rapid rise, while Obama perhaps found Biden a bit long-winded or prone to gaffes. It wasn't a natural friendship initially. The choice was highly strategic, almost transactional.
Obama needed the foreign policy credibility.
Exactly. Obama was a first-term senator. Biden had chaired the Foreign Relations Committee for years, traveled the world, knew countless leaders. He provided ballast, experienced national security credentials. Plus, Biden still had that connection to white working-class voters, particularly in states like Pennsylvania and Ohio, that Obama hoped to win.
So, a marriage of convenience that worked out politically.
It worked out brilliantly politically. And interestingly, by all accounts, they developed a genuinely close personal relationship during their 8 years in the White House. The initial strategic calculation evolved into real affection and trust, partly helped, apparently, by the fact their daughters attended the same school.
So let's move into that vice presidency, 2009 to 2017. How did Biden define his role? He wasn't just a ceremonial figurehead.
No, definitely not. He famously said his goal was often to be the last man in the room with the president, offering his candid advice. He saw himself as a contrarian at times, someone who could challenge prevailing opinions within the administration to ensure Obama heard all sides of an argument.
Did that play out in major policy debates?
It certainly did, particularly regarding Afghanistan early on. There was a big internal debate about sending more troops to the surge. Biden argued strongly against a large troop increase, favoring a more limited counterterrorism approach focused on al-Qaeda.
But he lost that argument initially, didn't he?
He did. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and the military leadership favored the surge, and Obama ultimately went with that plan, sending about 21,000 additional troops. However, Biden's skepticism lingered, and his perspective reportedly gained more weight later as Obama grew disillusioned with the Afghanistan strategy.
So his contrarian view eventually had influence, even if delayed.
It seems so. He also took the lead on Iraq policy, managing the withdrawal of U.S. troops by the end of 2011, drawing on his deep relationships in the region.
Domestically, he had a major role in the Recovery Act, the stimulus package.
Yes, Obama put him in charge of overseeing the implementation of the massive infrastructure spending within the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. His job was to prevent waste and fraud.
How'd it go?
By his own account, and reports at the time, quite well. He held regular meetings, tracked projects meticulously, and his team reported a fraud rate of less than 1%, which for a program that vast was considered a significant achievement in effective oversight.
Of course, the public often remembers the VP years for Biden being Biden.
Right.
The unscripted moments.
Ah, yes, the gaffes, though sometimes they were more like revealing moments of authenticity. The most famous, perhaps, was the hot mic moment at the Affordable Care Act signing ceremony in 2010.
Leaning into Obama and whispering.
This is a big fucking deal, which, perfectly captured the relief and significance many Democrats felt at finally passing major healthcare reform. It became legendary.
But another unscripted moment had arguably much bigger policy consequences, didn't it, on same-sex marriage?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That was in May 2012, during an interview on Meet the Press. He was asked about his views on same-sex marriage, and he just came out and said, "I am absolutely comfortable with the fact that men marrying men, women marrying women, and heterosexual men and women marrying another are entitled to the same exact rights."
And this was before Obama had officially endorsed it.
Yes. The official White House position at the time was that Obama's views were evolving.
Yeah.
Biden's statement was made without administration clearance, apparently. It put immediate, intense pressure on Obama.
Forced his hand, essentially.
Many believe so. Just 3 days later, President Obama publicly announced his personal support for same-sex marriage. Biden's off-the-cuff remark effectively accelerated the timeline on a major civil rights issue.
He also played a key role in some tough legislative negotiations using those Senate relationships.
Definitely. He was central to negotiating the 2010 tax cut compromise with Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell during the lame duck session. That deal extended the Bush-era tax cuts, but also included unemployment benefit extensions Democrats wanted. He prided himself on being able to cut deals across the aisle.
But that reputation sometimes worked against him within his own party.
It did. Some Democrats felt he gave away too much in those negotiations. That perception led to him being somewhat sidelined during the high-stakes debt ceiling negotiations in 2011 and again during the 2013 government shutdown talks. Party leaders apparently worried he was too eager to compromise with Republicans.
So a VP who was influential, sometimes controversial, often unscripted, but deeply involved in policy.
That sums it up well. A very active and consequential vice president.
After leaving office in 2017, what did he do? Did he signal a potential 2020 run early on?
Not immediately. He and Jill Biden focused on other things initially. They made a significant amount of money through speaking fees and book deals. His memoir, Promise Me Dad, about Beau's illness and death, was a bestseller. They earned over $15 million between 2017 and 2019.
A substantial income spike after decades of public service salaries.
Quite substantial. He also took up academic affiliations, becoming an honorary professor at the University of Pennsylvania and launching the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement. It kept him involved in policy circles.
But the pull towards 2020 must have been strong, especially with Trump in the White House.
It seems the primary motivation was, as he framed it, a sense of duty. He launched his campaign in April 2019, explicitly stating he felt compelled to run because he believed President Trump posed a fundamental threat to the nation's values and standing in the world.
He wasn't the only Democrat running, though. It was a crowded field. What made him the frontrunner?
Initially, it was name recognition and the Obama connection. But his most durable advantage, the one that carried him through, was perceived electability. Poll after poll showed him performing best against Trump in hypothetical matchups.
And Democratic primary voters were laser-focused on beating Trump.
Overwhelmingly. So even when younger, perhaps more exciting candidates challenged him, Biden's perceived strength against Trump kept him popular, especially among moderate and older Democrats, and crucially, black voters.
That campaign wasn't smooth sailing, though. The Ukraine issue blew up early.
Yes, the whole situation involving the Trump administration pressuring Ukraine's President Zelensky to announce investigations into Joe Biden and his son Hunter became a dominant storyline.
Trump wanted investigations into Hunter's role on the board of Burisma, a Ukrainian energy company, and this debunked conspiracy theory about Joe Biden forcing out a prosecutor to protect his son.
Right. The allegation was that Biden misused his power as VP. Multiple investigations and journalistic accounts found no evidence of wrongdoing by Joe Biden. The prosecutor he pushed to oust was widely seen as corrupt by the U.S., the EU, and international bodies.
But the pressure campaign itself was the issue.
Exactly. The fact that President Trump appeared to be leveraging U.S. foreign policy and military aid to damage a political opponent led directly to the House of Representatives impeaching Trump for abuse of power and obstruction of Congress in December 2019.
So Biden's family life, specifically Hunter's business dealings, became central to the political fight even before he won the nomination.
Absolutely. It foreshadowed the attacks he would face constantly.
Despite that, and despite some really poor showings in the first couple of primaries.
Iowa and New Hampshire were disasters for him. He finished 4th and 5th, respectively. It looked like his campaign might collapse, just like in '88 and '08.
What turned it around?
South Carolina. And specifically, the overwhelming support of black voters there, galvanized by a key endorsement from Representative Jim Clyburn. Biden won South Carolina decisively.
And that momentum was unstoppable.
It created a wave. She went on to dominate Super Tuesday, winning 10 out of 14 states. His main rivals quickly dropped out and endorsed him. He effectively secured the nomination by April 2020. He framed himself perfectly for that moment, saying, "I view myself as a bridge, not as anything else."
A bridge to the next generation, and his VP pick reflected that.
Very much so. Choosing Kamala Harris, then a U.S. Senator from California, was historic. She was the first African-American woman and the first South Asian American person on a major party's presidential ticket. It fulfilled his promise to have a diverse administration and signaled a transition in leadership.
Okay, so on to the presidency itself. January 2021. Inaugurated at 78, the oldest ever, second Catholic president, first from Delaware. What was the atmosphere like?
It was tense and very unusual. Because of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, the crowds were extremely limited. And because of the January 6th attack on the Capitol just 2 weeks earlier, security was incredibly tight throughout Washington, D.C. It was a very muted, almost somber affair compared to typical inaugurations.
What were his first moves in office, setting the tone?
He signed a flurry of executive orders on day one, aimed largely at reversing Trump administration policies. He rejoined the Paris Agreement on climate change, stopped the U.S. withdrawal from the World Health Organization, revoked the permit for the Keystone XL oil pipeline, and ended the declared national emergency at the U.S.-Mexico border.
A clear signal of a different direction, especially on climate and international cooperation.
Absolutely. A sharp pivot.
Domestically, the first couple of years were marked by some major legislative action. The Democratic Party controlled the House and, narrowly, the Senate.
Right, they had the narrowest possible Senate majority 50-50, with Vice President Harris breaking ties. But they managed to push through three really significant pieces of legislation, what some call the legislative trifecta.
First up was the COVID relief package.
Yes, the American Rescue Plan Act, ARP, signed in March 2021. A massive $1.9 trillion bill designed to address the ongoing economic and health crises from the pandemic.
What was in it?
Direct stimulus payments to most Americans, extended federal unemployment benefits, substantial funding for schools to reopen safely, money for COVID testing and vaccine distribution, aid to state and local governments. It was a huge injection of federal funds.
Aimed at immediate relief and recovery.
Exactly. Short-term boost.
Then came the infrastructure bill.
The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act,
Yeah.
AIJA. This one was different because it was genuinely bipartisan, passed later in 2021.
How much money and what did it target?
About $1.2 trillion in total, with around $550 billion in new spending. It focused on traditional infrastructure roads, bridges, public transit, water pipes, broadband internet expansion, upgrading the electrical grid, electric vehicle charging stations, things both parties generally agreed needed investment.
Getting significant Republican support for that was seen as a major win for Biden's approach.
It absolutely was. It showed he could still work across the aisle on big issues, fulfilling a key campaign promise.
And the third big one, arguably the most complex and maybe most impactful long-term, was the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA.
Right. Passed in the summer of 2022. This was essentially a scaled-back and repurposed version of his original, much larger Build Back Better plan, which had failed to pass the Senate due to opposition from moderate Democrats like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema.
How did they get this version through?
They used the budget reconciliation process, which requires only a simple majority in the Senate, bypassing a potential Republican filibuster. It passed strictly along party lines, 51-50, with VP Harris casting the tie-breaking vote.
What were the main components of the IRA?
It had three main pillars. First, significant investments in energy security and climate change, about $370 billion. Second, allowing Medicare to negotiate the prices of some high-cost prescription drugs for the first time and extending ACA subsidies. Third, it aimed to reduce the federal deficit, partly through a new minimum tax on large corporations.
The climate provisions were really substantial, weren't they?
Hugely substantial. Tax credits for electric vehicles, incentives for renewable energy production like solar and wind, funding for energy efficiency upgrades, support for domestic manufacturing of clean energy technology.
Yeah.
Analysts projected it would be the most significant climate legislation ever passed in the U.S.
What kind of impact was it expected to have on emissions?
Various models suggested it could help the U.S. cut its greenhouse gas emissions by somewhere between 31% and 44% below 2005 levels by the year 2030. A really major step toward meeting international climate goals.
So ARP for immediate relief, IIJA for bipartisan infrastructure, IRA for climate and health care, a pretty productive legislative run.
Objectively, yes, especially given the razor-thin margins in Congress. Historians will likely look back on it as a period of significant legislative output.
Which brings us back to that paradox. All this legislation passed, yet public approval remained low. Why? What was happening with the economy overall?
The data painted a confusing picture. On one hand, you had really strong indicators. GDP growth in 2021 was 5.9%, the fastest in nearly 4 decades.
Job growth was strong too, right? Unemployment fell sharply.
Very sharply. The unemployment rate dropped from over 6% when he took office to a 53-year low of 3.4% by early 2023. Millions of jobs were created. Household wealth also increased significantly. By traditional metrics, the economy looked quite robust.
But that's not what people felt.
No, because the dominant economic story, the one that impacted everyone's daily lives, was inflation.
It really took off in 2021 and 2022.
It soared. Year-over-year inflation peaked at 9.1% in June 2022, a level not seen since the early 1980s. Prices for gas, groceries, housing, everything seemed to be going up rapidly.
And even though the inflation rate eventually came down significantly?
It did. It fell to around 3% by the end of his term. But the cumulative effect of that price surge was huge. The overall consumer price index rose about 21.3% during his 4 years in office.
And critically, wages didn't quite keep up with that cumulative rise for many people.
That's the key. Average wage growth was around 19% over the same period. So while wages were rising on paper, many families felt like their purchasing power was eroding because prices had risen even faster. That feeling of falling behind or just struggling to afford basics overshadowed the good news about jobs.
And that frustration directly impacted his approval ratings.
Overwhelmingly, poll after poll showed inflation and the cost of living were the top concerns for voters, and the primary reasons cited for dissatisfaction with his presidency. He simply couldn't shake the perception that the economy was bad for ordinary people, despite the positive macroeconomic data.
Let's touch on a few other domestic areas. The judiciary.
A major focus for him, and an area where he arguably had a huge lasting impact. His most high-profile appointment, of course, was Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court.
The first black woman to serve on the court.
Historic. But beyond that, his administration prioritized diversity across the entire federal bench to an unprecedented degree.
How many judges did he appoint overall?
In just one term, he appointed 235 federal judges. That's more than any president in their first term in the last 50 years. And the diversity numbers were striking. About 63% of his appointees were women, and 60% were non-white. That fundamentally reshapes the judiciary for decades to come.
What about labor issues? He often called himself the most pro-union president.
He definitely leaned into that identity. He took the unprecedented step in 2023 of actually joining striking United Auto Workers members on a picket line in Michigan, the first sitting president ever to do so.
But he also intervened to stop a potentially crippling railroad strike in 2022, didn't he?
He did. Congress passed legislation forcing railroad workers to accept a contract they had rejected, averting a strike that economists warned could devastate the supply chain. So, a bit of a balancing act there between supporting unions and protecting the broader economy.
Fiscal issues, debt ceiling, student loans.
He signed the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023, a bipartisan deal negotiated with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy to raise the debt ceiling and averts a potentially catastrophic default. It included some spending caps. On student loans, he pursued ambitious forgiveness plans.
But those faced major hurdles.
Huge legal challenges. His initial plan for broad student loan forgiveness was struck down by the Supreme Court. Subsequent efforts were more targeted, but still faced opposition and criticism over their cost, estimated at over $500 billion, and questions of fairness. It was a key promise, especially to younger voters, that proved very difficult to deliver on fully.
Okay, shifting to the world stage. Foreign policy under Biden was dominated by some major crises.
Absolutely. It felt like one thing after another. From the end of America's longest war to the return of large-scale conflict in Europe and renewed tensions in the Middle East and with China.
Let's start with Afghanistan, the withdrawal in August 2021.
That was arguably the lowest point of his first year in office, certainly in foreign policy terms. He followed through on the agreement negotiated by the Trump administration to withdraw all U.S. troops, though he extended the deadline slightly.
What was his justification for pulling out completely?
His core argument was that the U.S. mission had been accomplished years ago degrading al-Qaeda, and that staying longer wouldn't change the outcome. He famously said American troops shouldn't be dying in a war, that Afghan forces weren't willing to fight for themselves. He wanted to end the forever war.
But the execution was widely seen as chaotic, even disastrous.
The speed of the Taliban takeover stunned everyone, including the administration. Biden himself admitted the collapse unfolded more quickly than we had anticipated. The scenes at the Kabul airport, with desperate Afghans trying to flee, were heartbreaking and politically damaging.
There was immense criticism from both parties, allies.
Intense criticism over the planning and execution. However, the administration also pointed to the massive airlift operation evacuating over 120,000 people. Americans, allies, vulnerable Afghans, in a very short time under dangerous conditions as an extraordinary success in logistical terms. But the image of chaos and abandonment lingered.
Then just a few months later, Russia invaded Ukraine, February 2022. How did the administration respond?
Swiftly and strongly, in coordination with allies, they imposed unprecedented economic sanctions on Russia, targeting banks, oligarchs, energy exports. They also authorized huge amounts of military and financial aid to Ukraine.
How much aid are we talking about?
Over the course of the war, during his term, Congress approved roughly $113 billion in total assistance for Ukraine. Biden consistently rallied international support for Kyiv and framed the conflict as a global struggle between democracy and autocracy, directly blaming Putin for the resulting energy and food price shocks.
But there was a clear limit to U.S. involvement, wasn't there? A line they wouldn't cross.
Yes, a very deliberate line. Biden consistently refused Ukrainian requests to use longer-range American weapons to strike targets deep inside Russian territory.
Why that restriction?
The stated reason was fear of escalation, avoiding actions that could provoke a direct military conflict between NATO and nuclear-armed Russia. They wanted to support Ukraine's defense without triggering World War III. He did eventually grant a limited exception for using some weapons for counterfire purposes just across the border near Kharkiv in 2024, but the general prohibition on deep strikes remained.
Let's talk about China. How did relations evolve?
The relationship became defined by competition, even confrontation. Biden framed China as the United States' most serious competitor and organized alliances to counter its influence.
But the Yorkist Pact was a big part of that.
A very big part. The security agreement between Australia, the UK, and the US, focused on providing Australia with nuclear-powered submarine technology, was clearly aimed at countering China's military buildup in the Indo-Pacific.
And Taiwan remained a major flashpoint. Biden made some comments that seemed to shift U.S. policy.
He did, repeatedly. On several occasions, he stated unequivocally that the U.S. would defend Taiwan militarily if China invaded. These statements went beyond the long-standing U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity.
And the White House had to walk those comments back.
Each time, yes. Administration officials would clarify that U.S. policy hadn't officially changed. It created confusion and suggested a possible gap between the president's personal views and established diplomatic doctrine.
Were there other concrete actions taken towards China?
Yes. The administration ordered the shoot-down of a suspected Chinese surveillance balloon that flew across the U.S. in February 2023. In 2024, Biden significantly increased tariffs on various Chinese goods, like electric vehicles, solar panels, steel, and batteries, citing unfair trade practices. And he signed legislation aimed at forcing the divestiture or ban of the popular app TikTok due to concerns about its Chinese ownership.
So a much more confrontational stance than perhaps seen under Obama.
Definitely more overtly competitive and confrontational, continuing and expanding on some trends that began under Trump, but embedding them within a strategy of strengthening alliances.
Finally, the conflict in the Middle East. The Gaza war, starting in late 2023.
A major crisis that consumed a huge amount of the administration's attention in its final year and a half. After the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7, 2023, Biden offered immediate ironclad support for Israel's right to defend itself.
He condemned Hamas unequivocally.
Yes, as a terrorist organization, and deployed U.S. naval assets to the region as a deterrent. However, as Israel's military response in Gaza intensified, leading to a catastrophic humanitarian crisis and vast numbers of Palestinian civilian casualties, the administration faced growing pressure.
Pressure from allies, human rights groups, and within the Democratic Party itself.
Intense pressure to take a tougher line with Israel, condition military aid, and push harder for a ceasefire and humanitarian access.
How did Biden navigate that?
It was a very difficult tightrope walk. He publicly and privately urged Israel to minimize civilian harm and allow more aid into Gaza. But he resisted calls for conditioning aid or demanding an immediate, permanent ceasefire. He supported temporary humanitarian pauses.
The administration did try to facilitate aid delivery directly, didn't they?
Yes. They initiated large-scale airdrops of food and supplies into Gaza and undertook a major military project to build a temporary pier off the coast to deliver aid by sea. However, aid organizations consistently said these efforts, while welcome, were far from sufficient given the scale of the need and the difficulties of distribution inside Gaza.
Did the situation resolve before he left office?
In the very final week of his presidency, his administration strongly backed a multi-phase ceasefire proposal that included hostage releases and a surge in aid. Hamas reportedly accepted the terms of the initial phase just days before the end of Biden's term, bringing a fragile pause to the fighting.
So a presidency bookended by foreign policy crises.
Afghanistan at the start. Ukraine and Gaza dominating the middle and end. It really underscored the volatile international landscape he inherited and navigated.
Throughout all this, domestic and foreign, there was the constant underlying issue of his age.
He was unavoidable. As the oldest president ever, his health, stamina, and cognitive fitness were under constant scrutiny, amplified by political opponents and media coverage of every verbal slip or unsteady moment.
And that scrutiny intensified significantly after the report by Special Counsel Robert Hur.
Yes, the Hur report investigated Biden's handling of classified documents after his vice presidency. While Hur concluded that criminal charges were not warranted, the report included some highly damaging, politically charged descriptions of the president's memory.
What specifically did Hur write?
He described Biden as a sympathetic, well-meaning, elderly man with a poor memory. He noted instances during interviews where Biden apparently couldn't recall key dates, like when his term as vice president began or ended, or even, most painfully, the year his son Beau died.
Those details were explosive.
They fueled the narrative about his cognitive decline, even though allies pushed back strongly, saying the comments were unnecessary and politically motivated. But the damage was done. It fed directly into concerns leading up to the 2024 election cycle.
And those concerns crystallized during the first presidential debate against Trump in June 2024.
That debate performance was widely seen as a disaster for Biden. He sounded hoarse, paused frequently, and delivered several halting, meandering, and sometimes confusing answers.
The reaction was immediate and brutal.
Instantaneous panic among Democrats, pundits, donors, elected officials. The consensus formed rapidly that the performance was disqualifying, that he simply couldn't sustain the rigors of another campaign.
The pressure on him to step aside must have been immense.
Unbearable. Calls for him to withdraw grew louder by the day. After weeks of intense speculation and behind-the-scenes maneuvering, he finally announced his decision.
On July 21st, 2024, he withdrew from the presidential race.
Yes, becoming the first eligible incumbent president not to seek re-election since Lyndon Johnson in 1968. He endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris to lead the ticket. It was a stunning, unprecedented end to his re-election bid, driven almost entirely by concerns about his age and fitness, crystallized by that debate performance.
Even after withdrawing, his final months in office contained some really significant, even historic actions, particularly regarding pardons.
He used the pardon power quite extensively throughout his term, actually. More individual pardons and commutations than any president in decades, including those mass pardons for people convicted of simple federal marijuana possession.
Those were generally well received by reform advocates, but the later pardons were far more controversial.
Extremely controversial, starting with the pardon for his son, Hunter Biden, on December 1st, 2024.
This was after Hunter had been convicted on federal gun charges and was facing tax charges.
Yes, but the pardon went far beyond those specific cases. It was a full and unconditional pardon covering all potential federal offenses Hunter might have committed between 2014 and December 1st, 2024.
All potential offenses. That sounds incredibly broad.
It was described as unprecedented in its scope by legal analysts. It seemed clearly designed to preemptively shield Hunter from any further federal investigations or charges, possibly related to his overseas business dealings or accusations of trading on the family name, especially with a new administration coming in.
And this was despite Biden previously promising he wouldn't pardon his son.
Yes, he had repeatedly said he wouldn't interfere. The sweeping nature of the pardon, offering protection for unknown potential crimes, drew widespread criticism as an abuse of the pardon power for personal reasons.
And it didn't stop there. His very last day in office, January 20, 2025.
He issued another wave of preemptive pardons, this time covering several family members, including his brothers James and Francis, his sister Valerie, and their spouses, as well as key political figures associated with his administration or investigations into the previous one.
Who was included in that group?
Figures like Dr. Anthony Fauci, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs Mark Milley, and several individuals involved with the House January 6th committee.
What was the justification given for pardoning people who hadn't even been charged with, let alone convicted of, any crimes?
President Biden explicitly stated it was necessary because of his concern about baseless and politically motivated investigations that he anticipated from the incoming Trump administration. He framed it as protecting these individuals from political retribution.
So using the pardon power as a shield against perceived political weaponization of the justice system by his successor.
That's exactly how it was interpreted. A final, dramatic act using absolute presidential power to insulate his family and allies from future legal jeopardy, signaling a deep distrust in the political neutrality of the system he was leaving behind.
How, then, do we assess his presidency overall? The final verdict seems split.
Very much so. If you look at public opinion polls, his presidency ended with low approval ratings. His average approval in Gallup polling was around 42.2%, the second lowest for any president since World War II, only slightly higher than Donald Trump's average.
And that was driven mainly by?
Primarily by public frustration over inflation and the cost of living. That economic anxiety just seemed to swamp everything else in the public's perception.
But there's a contrasting view emerging already.
Yes, among historians and political scientists. Early rankings are placing his administration much more favorably, often in the top quartile or even higher. They point to the significant legislative achievements, the ARP, the infrastructure bill, the IRA's climate impact, the judicial appointments, the rebuilding of alliances.
It sounds a lot like the comparison people make to Jimmy Carter.
It's become a very common comparison. A one-term Democrat, seen as decent and intelligent, who achieved significant policy successes, like Carter's human rights focus or environmental action, but was ultimately defined in the public eye by economic struggles, particularly inflation, leading to a loss of public confidence.
It's also worth remembering some policy nuances that get lost in the main narratives, like on the environment.
That's a great example. While the IRA was a huge climate bill, his administration also oversaw record levels of domestic oil production in late 2023. And alongside actions like rejoining Paris, he also protected a massive amount of land and ocean, some 674 million acres through conservation measures. The reality was complex.
So to try and synthesize this immense career, we see extraordinary resilience, bouncing back from personal tragedy and political setbacks. We see real legislative effectiveness, especially during his presidency.
Absolutely. VIA, the Infrastructure Act, the IRA, those are substantial, lasting policy wins.
Yet, that effectiveness never translated into sustained public approval. The presidency was ultimately overshadowed by economic frustration and these deeply personal challenges related to his aides and his family, particularly Hunter.
It's a story of achieving significant policy goals while failing, ultimately, to win the battle for public perception in real time. The historical assessment might be kind, but the contemporary judgment was quite harsh.
Which brings us to our final thought for you, the listener. We've traced this incredibly long public life, deeply marked by personal loss and family ties. Now, consider the very end, those final sweeping pardons. They weren't just for specific crimes committed, but preemptively covered potential future charges against family, allies, key administration figures.
Pardons issued explicitly to shield them from anticipated investigations by the next administration.
How does that unprecedented act reshape our understanding of a presidential legacy in this era of hyperpartisanship and political targeting? What does it reveal about the perceived fragility of the political system itself when an outgoing president feels compelled to deploy the ultimate power of clemency, not just for past actions, but as a defensive shield against the future actions of his successor? It really forces us to question if the lines between law and politics have blurred beyond recognition.